Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Buongiorno. Okay, so before we get started, I want you all to give a huge round of applause to our dear organizers here for all the awesome work that they've done. And one more round of applause for you all for being here at the conference and this session, really taking the time to learn and giving yourself this space to connect with others as well. So, awesome. So my name is Simona Cotin, and I currently work as an engineering manager on the Angular team at Google right here in Zurich. So with some of you, we might be living in the same country. I'm originally from Romania. I used to work in London for Microsoft as well. And I've been living in Zurich for the past 2 years. I started working on the Angular team in July last year, and part of my responsibilities are working on the core of the framework, as well as working on the tooling for the Angular team. So I get to work with folks that build the Angular CLI, the Angular compiler, and many, many other tools that you might enjoy working. How many of you are using Angular in the room? Awesome. How many of you have used Angular only in the past 1 or 2 years? Okay, so I take it a lot of you are like users of Angular since probably the first editions, which is even better. Awesome. You can find me on Twitter at Simona_Cotin if you're interested in connecting there, or if you have any questions. Throughout the session, please feel free to also ask questions. And of course, there will be some time at the end to talk more about some of the things that you found interesting or you might have questions on as well. And I want us to start with a story. And it's a story about the American Air Force back in the 1950s. Pilots were having trouble controlling their aircraft, and incidents were really on the rise. And they couldn't understand why that was happening. So they looked at the skills, they looked at the tech, and nothing was coming up until they looked at the cockpit. And what was interesting about the cockpit was that it was created for the average person. But who is really the average person? What I discovered is that in trying to fit the average person, the cockpit wasn't actually a good fit for anyone. So once they made that discovery, they actually had a flourish of innovations, and they redesigned the controls in the cockpit to be adjustable so that they meet the unique needs of their pilots. And that really laid the foundation for the expansion of the Air Force to women and also building a more inclusive workforce. So you might be wondering, how does this apply to Angular, Simona? Well, we all know that Angular is a very opinionated framework, and we know that that's one of our strengths. Like, a lot of users say that they love the fact that there's only a certain amount of ways in which you can do things. And that's a good thing, because you get to share knowledge across teams, across companies, and you get to copy maybe from Stack Overflow one component, and it just works in your current project's environment. But we also know that each of you, like each of the pilots in that story, has a different set of problems that you have to solve for. And you also have a different set of tools that you love using, as well as a different set of customer needs that you might have to solve for. So just as the Air Force made those controls flexible, in the same way, we're building into the framework the knobs that allow you to use Angular exactly how you like it and how you need it. So we want to meet developers where they are. And one way in which we're doing this is through listening. For those of you that have filled in the annual Angular developer survey, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And for those of you that haven't, please go ahead and fill it in. It's still going to be open for the next few days. You can find it either on the website as the header, or you can go directly to our Twitter account and go to the link there, fill in only the questions that make sense to you. But know that this particular survey is actually extremely important to our team. A lot of the decisions that we make towards, or the roadmap that we plan for this year and next year, has to do with the feedback that you've sent as part of this survey. And to our knowledge, this is actually one of the largest front-end surveys out there, with more than 20,000 people having responded in the last year's survey. So looking at the data here, we see a couple of things. We see that you absolutely love how productive Angular makes you feel. And we also notice that you enjoy how Angular helps you keep up to date with new releases. For those of you that haven't used Angular, we actually have a ng update command that will help you very easily update to some of the latest versions. And it's extremely useful, especially in environments where you're aiming to keep up to date with security fixes and with some of the latest features. Having these types of migration tools that are also used internally at Google to migrate some of the largest applications that are written in Angular will give you a lot of productivity in doing so. But looking at this data, we also notice that there's opportunities for improvement, as there always is. So we noticed that you would love to have better support for debugging and profiling. So over the past few months, almost a year, the Angular team has collaborated with the Chrome DevTools team to launch improvements to the debugging experience directly into Chrome DevTools. And people from both teams worked together to enable developers to debug and profile their web apps from the authoring perspective. So in terms of their source language and project structure, with access to information that is familiar and relevant to developers and the authors of those projects. When debugging web applications using Chrome DevTools, authors generally want to see just their code, right? How many of you were searching for the files that you've authored? And as you might see in this screenshot as well, as I'm searching for app component, which is a file that I've authored, I'm getting a bunch of files that I have no idea what they are. I don't really care about. Well, maybe I should care about them. But they're definitely not files that you would want to see as you're building your own application, right? And this was something that we had to fix. And to achieve this, the DevTools team has introduced an extension to source maps called Google Ignore List. And this extension is used to identify third-party scripts and sources such as framework code and bundler-generated code. And when a framework uses this extension, authors will now automatically avoid code that they don't want to see or they don't want to step through without having to manually configure this beforehand. And notice that I said when a framework uses this extension, because as we worked with the DevTools team, we not only enabled this for Angular, this is now available for all the other web frameworks to use so that everyone in the web ecosystem can benefit from this improvement in their debugging experience. In practice, Chrome DevTools can automatically hide code identified as third-party in stack traces, in sources tree, and in the quick open dialog, which we saw earlier. And it can also improve the stepping and resuming behavior in the debugger. So here, again, we can see a regular stack trace where possibly it's not very visible, but a lot of the calls in the stack trace here have to do with Zone.js and the core of the framework, and only one or two calls there has to do with my own code. And after this set of improvements that we've made, now a lot of the stack traces are going to be relevant to the application that you're building, and you're going to get relevant information that will take you to the places where are actually throwing some of these errors. And the same, as I mentioned, applies to debugging and stepping through your code. So now you're going to have the context of your application within your debugging panel as well. Another feedback that we heard was that sometimes the error messages aren't very clear. How many of you can relate to that? Okay, not a lot of folks in the room. How many of you have run into this particular error, expression changed after checked? Okay, this is a usual, I see two hands there. Someone that has definitely been frustrated by this error. And we recognize that this is something that folks actually run into quite a lot, and know that we're working on actually removing this error and providing better platform overall that doesn't necessarily have to need this error. Cannot share more, but we're going to keep you updated over the next year. But some of the efforts that we have done as a team is spending a significant amount of time understanding what are the common errors that developers run through. And we did that by aggregating the Google search results, by going to Stack Overflow and aggregating Stack Overflow posts. We even went to Quora and kind of trying to understand what are people actually running into. And then we categorized these errors using error codes. We wrote detailed error reference pages on Angular.io. We partnered with Fireship.io to create some of these videos for visual learners or people who prefer to learn from videos. And then we link to these pages from the error stack trace. And hopefully that's going to significantly improve the experience that you have as you're debugging through your code and running into some of these more common errors that have very specific solutions. Going back to the survey, another clear area of improvement is testing. We see it there, and I see the nods. And in Angular version 12, we added support for 3 popular end-to-end testing frameworks, Cypress, Nightwatch, and WebDriver.io. For those of you that use Playwright, know that there's a migration guide for Playwright as well. It's not integrated directly into the CLI, but you can easily apply that migration into your project as well. And currently, new projects running ng end-to-end will walk developers through choosing one of these end-to-end frameworks. And these frameworks support custom tooling and schematics, which will automatically update your project so that you can integrate very well with these end-to-end projects. So rather than Angular owning the problem of end-to-end testing, we recognize that some of you might prefer using these other frameworks, and we wanted to make sure that you get the best support there. And in version 14, based on community feedback and via the request for comments process, how many of you know that the Angular team runs these processes, the request for comments process on GitHub? Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief overview there. Whenever we're introducing new features or we're making significant changes to the platform, we actually open up for discussion on the GitHub repository, a request for comments, where you can go and maybe ask questions, provide your feedback and your input about that particular feature, whether it would work well into your use case or not. So I highly encourage you to check out the GitHub repository, read some of the discussions that we have listed there. For example, we had one for strictly typed forms. We had one for standalone components, directives, and pipes. And there's a few that our team are planning over the next few months as well. So please check it out and provide your input. We really want to build a platform and a framework that works well for your use cases. It's important to have that type of use case input. But basically, based on that community feedback, we've decided to deprecate Protractor, while also working with the community to find a solution for long-term support for active projects that wish to continue using Protractor. We recognize that not all teams are in a place where they can immediately migrate from Protractor to a new end-to-end testing framework. So we wanted to make sure that you have that support, and we partnered with the independent team at Hero Devs, and they're going to fork Protractor and provide long-term support for that as well. But we do understand that end-to-end is only part of the story. And going into this year, we're focusing on investigating challenges with unit testing and improving the experience there as well. So please continue sending us your feedback. Don't forget about the Angular survey for this year, and stay tuned and give us feedback on RFCs as well. Switching gears a bit, we hear that you're all excited about native tooling and faster builds for both your dev and production environments. How many of you are familiar with esbuild? Awesome. Vite. Okay, so that's that's another tool that's extremely popular in this space. I know that the team at Vercel have also built TurboPack, yes, that's it. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening in the tooling space, and we wanted to make sure that you all get the chance to work with the latest and greatest. So we went to the whiteboard, and we decided, just based on our exploration, that we want to continue evolving the Angular tooling to support some of these newer and more performant tooling experiences. And currently, the Angular builder uses Webpack as a bundler. It uses esbuild for code optimizations like code inlining, and then it also applies Tensor for further code compression. So this is the current stable build pipeline that runs whenever you're using the Angular CLI. And while this configuration is performant, and we spent quite a bit of time working on that, with the recent evolution of tools like esbuild, we do think that we can do better. So last year, we introduced support for experimental esbuild-based build system for ngbuild, which compiles to pure ESM output and includes support for watch mode and your style sheets. Over the coming months and over the coming year, we're working to close the feature gap between what our current stable build pipeline offers you and what esbuild build pipeline would offer you, with the goal to make esbuild stable and eventually the default value. And if you're wondering why are we doing this work, so I have here side by side 2 different Hello World projects, which obviously are relatively small projects. On the left-hand side, I'm building with the currently stable build version, and you can see that a cold build takes about 7.1 seconds for projects, while the esbuild project takes about 3.6 seconds. And this is consistent with our findings that with esbuild, we have 75% faster cold build times. And we know that this is one of the bigger pain points with teams that are building large projects, that sometimes builds take much longer than they would expect. So by landing some of these improvements, we're hoping that we're gonna improve the developer experience there as well. You can enable this in your projects today by editing angular.json and replacing build Angular browser with Angular browser esbuild. And this feature is in experimental mode right now. Please give it a try and share feedback with us if you're running into any kind of issues, if you're seeing unexpected output. Go on GitHub, Angular CLI, and file a GitHub issue. Charles on our team is going to be very happy about that and continue investigating what is going on. Shifting gears a bit, another strong theme that we talk about is reducing the learning curve for Angular. And one way to do that is by reducing the number of concepts that developers need to learn early in their journey. And we've decided to work towards making ng modules optional. How many of you have already heard about standalone components, directives, and pipes? Okay, so just a few of you. Awesome, there's gonna be a lot that you're gonna just learn here. But let's look at what's the state of Angular applications today. As you can see in this Hello World application, In order to get started with the simplest application, developers need to write a component. They need to declare it in an ng module, and then they need to bootstrap that application. And for a new user, either to Angular or a new user to web development altogether, that's a lot of information to parse as you're just getting started. And one of the first areas of potential confusion, especially for new web developers, but also for seasoned web developers, might be, well, what is the difference between ng module and JS module? Because after all, it's in the name. They seem to be the same thing. What's going on here? So we authored a guide that actually goes through those examples. Furthermore, the ng module's API surface can be complex, and it has multiple responsibilities. We are breaking that single responsibility principle that's well-loved and respected. It includes compile time configuration through the declarations array, as well as runtime configuration through the dependency injection providers. It's also responsible for composability and grouping through the imports and exports array. So there's a lot to process here in this API. And we recognize that ng modules are a great way to organize an application and kind of separate the concerns in your applications. And over time, many patterns have emerged. And we see different types of modules being used depending on the use case and some of the patterns that teams are adopting. These are all great tools for more complex applications. But we wanted to explore what a simplified version would actually look like. And that's when we decided to work on standalone components, directives, and pipes. And getting started with Angular using standalone components is as simple as writing your component and then directly bootstrapping the application using that component. And you can see that it requires both less concepts as well as a smaller amount of code right from the beginning. So on the left-hand side, that's the simplest application that you would write that uses ng modules. And on the right-hand side, you have the standalone version of that application. So definitely, even visually, it looks much simpler. One of the side effects of standalone is that components are now the smallest unit of reuse, and you can lazy load your component. And particularly, this is important in the case of the router config, where now you can directly lazy load your components in your router config. And as we rewrote some of these router APIs to add support for standalone, it actually enabled us to shave off 11% of the router bundle, which you would benefit from as well. You would get a smaller bundle for your application out of the box. And to be clear, the goal is not to remove ng modules, but rather to enable this getting started experience that doesn't require folks to learn about ng modules immediately. As your application grows, you might consider, do I want to use ng modules as a way to structure my application and have these types of units of my application structured in this way? But as you're getting started, we highly recommend that you start by adopting these standalone components, directives, and pipes, and then introduce ng modules only if needed. However, know that right from the beginning, as we designed this feature, one of the things that was most important to us was interoperability. So the ability to use standalone components in ng modules and ng modules in standalone components. Because we know that the entire ecosystem currently depends on ng modules, and for your applications to be healthy and for our ecosystem to be healthy, we need to be able to use existing libraries into new projects and the other way around. So you can see here, very blurry, that I am importing common module into a standalone component. So it's easy to use one or the other. Apart from simplifying the learning journey, standalone also allows us to ship features that weren't possible before. For example, let's take this scenario where you have two directives that should always be used together. How do you ensure that these are always used together? So the example here says that we're creating a CDK tooltip directive, and we have the CDK menu, CDK tooltip, and we want to apply those on the directive. How would you do that? Always apply two directives on a third directive. Well, one way you might think about doing is, well, I will just extend two different directives. But the problem is that TypeScript doesn't actually allow you to do that. You cannot extend two different classes in a TypeScript class. You could also remember to always apply these two directives on each element. But can anyone guess what's the challenge there? It's very error prone, right? When you have to change the behavior, you're going to have to remember to make those changes on every single element and make those edits every single time. If you're feeling adventurous, another option is that you use TypeScript mixins, which allows you to inherit from multiple classes, but they require a lot of boilerplate. And if you're using this in Angular, it doesn't support features like host bindings and dependency injection. So you wouldn't have the full capabilities of Angular available with this approach. And a lot of you have signaled on GitHub that this is a very important feature for you. So that's another place where we listen for feedback, GitHub issues. And this was one of the most voted feature out of all feature requests that we get for Angular. So in Angular version 15, we introduced the Directive Composition API, which is actually enabled by Standalone APIs. And with this new Directive Composition API, you can rewrite the previous example like this. On your component, you define a list of host directives where you include the directives that you want to apply to this component, and then they become available immediately in your component. If you also want to expose the disabled input and the closed output, you can use them and potentially rename them as well if you want to, by defining them in the host directives field in your component decorator. And some of the features that are available in the new composition API are that you can apply as many directives to a host as you want. Obviously, it's good to be not have like infinity of host directives, but you can apply as many as you need. Inputs and outputs are hidden by default, and the developer has to decide which ones should be visible and rename them if needed. All Angular features are supported, so you can use dependency injection, host bindings, lifecycle hooks, and everything else that you might want to use. Host directives execute before their host to allow for any of the defaults to be overridden. You can chain them, and they're also injectable, so you can inject one and the other, but not both at the same time. There are some things that we had to put some controls in, so you can only use them with standalone directives. Components cannot be used as host directives, but obviously you can use host directives in components. And you can only have one directive instance per element. If you want to learn more about this, we have an Angular YouTube channel, in case you weren't aware, where we publish some of these smaller chunks of in-depth information or tutorials. Highly recommend you check this one out from Jeremy Alburn. Ultimately, as we're building these features, our goal is to help you put the user at the center, while also reducing the friction for building great experiences on the web. And optimizing for quality user experience, from our perspective, is key to the long-term success of any application that you're building. And in order to measure that user experience, one tool that we recommend using is Web Vitals or Core Web Vitals. And how many of you are familiar with Core Web Vitals? Okay, quite a bit of hands, probably half of the room. That's awesome. For those of you that are not familiar, Core Web Vitals are actually covering a much larger set of metrics, but the ones that currently make up the core ones are focused on three aspects of the user experience: loading, interactivity, and stability. So the first one, largest contentful paint, it really measures loading performance, and to provide a good user experience, LCP should occur within the first 2.5 seconds of when the page first starts loading. First input delay measures interactivity, and that experience has to happen within the first 100 milliseconds, and cumulative layout shift measures visual stability, and pages should maintain a CLS of 0.1 or less. So these are the three that you should always keep in mind as you're thinking about your good user experience. And over the past few years, we've worked with the Aurora team in Chrome to investigate how we can improve Core Web Vitals for Angular projects at large. So one approach here is that we tell all developers, we write beautiful documentation, and we tell all developers, here's all the things that you should consider as you're building applications. And you have to learn everything about what makes up LCP, what makes up FID and CLC, cumulative layout shift, and all the best practices required for you to implement. The other option is that we build some of those best practices as defaults within the platform. So then you're set up for success to build great user experiences. And one of the recent focuses for us has been LCP, so largest contentful paint. And in particular, we see that 71 to 79% of pages had an LCP element that was an image, which hinted that we should probably focus on providing good defaults for images, and that will automatically result in better LCP for all Angular applications. So given this data, we wanted to make it easy to adopt these performance best practices. In particular, we focused on lazy loading images that are not part of the LCP, so any images that are below the fold, we wanted to lazy load them, while also prioritizing loading critical images which are above the fold and make up your LCP element. We also worked on providing optimized configuration for popular image loaders, like image CDNs, and guiding developers with a set of useful errors and warnings that kind of give you hints at what you should look at next as you're incorporating images into your websites. You can adopt this in your applications today. Let's say you have this image that has a link to a beautiful sunset image over the Lugano skyline. In order to adopt the image directive, you have to update your image element to use ng-src. And that will immediately improve your core web vitals. Of course, you have to do a bit more, go beyond that to fully benefit from this optimization, but that's the first step. And then there's getting started with ng-optimized image guide on angular.io that will walk you through all of the steps required to adopt this new feature. The image directive is instable, it's available to use today. And looking ahead, we're exploring a lot of exciting efforts and exciting features that we hope that will bring that excellent developer experience that will help you build great user experiences. A couple of them are related to documentation. We hear over and over that the Angular documentation would benefit from simplifying the initial learning journey from making it more usable and including consistency of presentation of topics. We're working on all of that. We're also exploring improvements that can make server-side rendering better. We're looking at things like non-destructive hydration, adding standalone support in Angular Universal, ESM support, and dev server improvement and compile time improvements. And finally, we're exploring reactivity and asking questions like, can we have per component change detection instead of top-down global change detection? Can we have zoneless Angular? We know that a lot of you might struggle through understanding how Zone.js impacts your application, especially when you're in the zone and outside the zone. What about computed properties? We know that as you've used some other frameworks, you might have had the opportunity to use computed properties. It would be interesting to have that as part of Angular as well. But most importantly, we're exploring all of these topics with the priority of evolving Angular while maintaining platform stability and bringing everyone along. And we want to continue maintaining the properties of an opinionated framework that includes the knobs so that developers can use it in a way that it exactly fits your needs. Grazie. Thank you. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Maybe I can start with a question. Anyone wants to raise their hand and talk through what they would like to see in Angular next, or what made them excited about what they just saw? And since you have the mic, you can start.
No. I'm not a front-end developer, so...
Anyone wants to help Daniele?
Please. Rescue me. So no question at all?
Okay.
We have the first one.
No stupid questions.
We'll see. No, one of the experiences that we talked about regarding esbuild, so we can improve on the build time. And Angular has a view of the word regarding translations where they say one build per language. And so let's say that we have a kind of complex app. It takes 20 minutes to build, and we have to multiply that by environment and by language. So I would like to know what is the reasoning behind this philosophy, this choice, and if switching away from it, and for example, we're using ngx translate to avoid the per language build, we're even wondering if we can actually remove the per environment build by, for example, having a pretty funny URL in a containerized front end, where we can fetch our environment.ts version. And I would like to know your thoughts about it, like if it's something that we should really avoid for some reason that we don't know, or...
That is actually a very good question. And I think that a lot of folks are wondering about that. I don't have the full context of how we made those decisions, but what I know is that it was a trade-off between being able to generate those translations at build time and basically offloading the time in the developer environment or the pre-production environment to some extent, versus applying those translations at runtime and kind of slowing down the application for the user. So I think that's one of a very simplified version. And I don't know how you're seeing that in your day-to-day application, because it sounds like you are kind of offloading that responsibility of translating your application to the user rather than spending that time at build time.
That is what we are doing at the moment, yes.
Yeah, and do you find that it has any performance, any like significant performance impact?
Not much, honestly, since at least the translations are incremental in a way. It depends on how much of the application you're using, in our application at least. So you can have different paths of user behavior, different patterns, and depending on what the user needs, it will fetch additional translations. So we don't have like a very large document to download. We see more about the build time because of the current state of Node, I think. I don't know where the blame is at the moment, but
yeah, this is not a unique need of your application. We've heard this from other developers as well, and it is something on our roadmap to think about and see if there's ways in which we can optimize this challenge. Because yes, totally, you're absolutely right. Having to generate like 20 applications if you support 20 different languages and have that deploy in 10 regions, that's like a lot of work to consider. Thank you for your wonderful question. Anyone else? Okay, I think we can wrap up. I'll still be around. If you have any other questions, happy to answer them. But thank you so much for joining the session, and thank you so much for using Angular.